gets to define the United States past? Teaching American kids the truth about slavery and genocidal displacement has turned into a partisan battle, and it's fueled a national political debate over how to understand U.S. history and racism.
Let me be clear, there's no room in our classrooms for things like critical race theory.
And Florida isn't the only one. 22 other states have proposed similar bans on teaching institutional racism and the impacts of white supremacy. But not everyone is like the US. Other countries have decided to directly confront the ugly past in order to have a better present. Why are Brazil, Germany, and South Africa teaching their dark racist history? And can the US learn anything from them?
Until we deal with the structure, we're never going to be able to put that past behind us.
The first step a country needs to take in order to properly teach its dark racist history is to acknowledge there is a dark racist history in the first place. Currently, in the United States, there is no national curriculum for teaching the country's history. In fact, 5 states don't directly mention slavery in their state standards. 8 states don't require teaching the civil rights movement, and a report found that 87% of states don't dictate teaching about indigenous history post-1900s. Similarly to the US, Brazil has a history rooted in slavery. But Brazil has at least acknowledged on a national level its racist past and its systematic racism. In 2010, former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva said, "Brazil would not be what it is today without the participation of millions of Africans who helped build our country." More Africans were taken to Brazil than any other country in the world, over 4 million people. Brazil was also the last country to abolish slavery in the Western Hemisphere. And while there are no racially oriented policy post-slavery in Brazil, such as apartheid in South Africa or Jim Crow in the US, Brazil created a lot of obstacles that prevented Black people from accessing lands, the labor market, and education. Racism was finally declared a crime in the 1988 Constitution. Under the Lula and Dilma administrations, several policies were passed in favor of Black people. The Secretariat for Racial Equality was established, and the teaching of Afro-Brazilian and indigenous history and culture were made mandatory in elementary and high schools, regardless if they were public or private schools.
The law that implemented the racial history in schools, affirmative action law, a public policy in terms of education, all these measures were very important to raise awareness in Brazil. But more than that, to put this debating table, our history as Black people is not only about pain, it's not only about sharing the experience in colonialism and slavery. Our history as Black people is also a history of resistance.
However, it's one thing to make something law, and another thing to actually implement the law. According to Ribeiro, many Afro-Brazilians weren't aware of their new rights.
We have very good examples in some cities that, yes, the law was implemented in the way it should be, but on the other hand, it's still a struggle for the Black movement in Brazil to implement the law effectively, because there are a lot of mayors and governors that do not implement the law.
But current President Bolsonaro has said Brazil owed nothing to Afro-Brazilians.
I think that we are facing now in Brazil a very difficult time. It's very important to say under Bolsonaro administrations, a lot of public policies were ended.
While it's obvious that challenges remain in Brazil, acknowledging the past is the first step. So what comes after acknowledging the past? Here, the US could learn something from Germany. The Holocaust was the racialized and systematic state-sponsored mass murder of at least 6 million Jews, as well as hundreds of thousands of Romani people, intellectually disabled, dissidents, and those who were gay. For decades after World War II, Germans saw themselves as the victims of war. But that view began to change following the televised trials of Adolf Eichmann, a chief architect of the Holocaust, and the Auschwitz trials of former Nazi war criminals from 1963 to 1965.
The Germans were the first people to take another step and say, you know what, yes, we did suffer after the war and during the war, but other people suffered worse, and that was our fault. And it took about 40 years for West Germany to come to that position.
Under a concept known as Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which loosely means working off the past, Germany began to examine, analyze, and ultimately hold itself accountable for its dark past.
And it's work that will take more than one generation. Because it goes really quite deep. It goes to your own understanding of your ancestors and your own self-understanding as a member of a particular nation.
The teaching of this dark history is in all areas of German culture.
The Holocaust is taught so thoroughly in classrooms that my 3 Jewish children at various points in their school days said, "Enough already."
It is illegal to deny that the Holocaust was real. With a few exceptions for the sake of education, it is also illegal to make, sell, or display any symbols of the Nazi era. Instead, memorials of remembrance are everywhere to honor the array of victims of the Nazi regime. So, what comes after acknowledgement and accountability? Reconciliation. The US can learn to reconcile from the past. South Africa formally introduced apartheid in 1948. Apartheid was an extremely violent system that enforced restrictions on Black people. It controlled where they could live and work. Resistance to apartheid within South Africa took many forms over the years. After spending 27 years in prison, Nelson Mandela was released in 1990, and negotiations to end apartheid formally began that year. Apartheid formally ended in 1994, following the country's first democratic election, in which Mandela was voted president. One of the first acts of the new parliament was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Act. The TRC was a set of hearings for victims and perpetrators of apartheid to openly speak about the disturbing past. Its premise was that perpetrators of abuses would be given amnesty for their crimes in exchange for speaking the truth. The hearings were broadcast regularly on national television,
which I never want to underestimate because it was so important to so many people, which is to find out the truth. And it placed a lot of emphasis on Black people forgiving white people for what they had done to us. And it was heavily criticized, both at the time, but in subsequent years, that criticism has grown even sharper for precisely that lack of attention to justice and the real focus on what I would call a sentimental, very emotional, but not structural response to white supremacy.
Despite the faults with the TRC, it did leave South Africa in a state where it couldn't deny the horrors of apartheid.
One of the huge strengths of the South African curriculum is that it does acknowledge what happened and it doesn't leave anybody in any confusion as to the reality of apartheid, what happened, how it affected people, and how it was overcome.
Students' textbooks highlight human rights abuses, racism, resistance to apartheid, and Black leaders. In Robinson's research, she observed some 9th grade classrooms where students are required to do an oral history project where they interview someone who was affected by apartheid. But because schools are still heavily segregated, the race of the teacher and race of the students plays a large role in how the history is received.
For example, what I found in my research was that white students saw the main legacy of apartheid as being racism. So the legacy existed very much on the emotional level. And that meant that if people stopped being racist, then all of the problems relating to apartheid would end. And that was also very much how it was taught, whereas the Black students were much more eager and willing to reflect on their own families' lives in relation to apartheid and to use apartheid to explain why their families were still poor or why their families were still struggling.
So, we've established that the US could learn from Brazil by acknowledging its racist past, Germany by taking accountability, and South Africa by reconciling the violence people endured. These 3 countries understood that they could not move forward without getting everyone on one accord. But one step without the other is not enough. Will the US ever fully tell the truth about its past?